What's up, y'all? Welcome back to the Onyx Report's Black Masculinist news for the day. Hope you're well. Today we're getting into a piece that you can find on motherjones.com, how our tax code is rigged against Black Americans. Now, the interesting thing about this is you can go with it to a number of different places, but I'm really not about to. I'm really not going to delve into the benefits of the tax code, the problems with the tax code. No, this article mentions a certain part of how the tax code impacts the Black family that I hadn't considered. Right. So let me see. I'm going to decide if I want to do a larger amount of the article than I was initially planning. Okay, so all right. So it centers around the book, as you could tell, by Professor Dorothy Brown, and reveals that what happens when white people make the rules, as they say. And I'm going to skip around some of the stuff that I really wasn't focusing on to get at the core of one of the things she states, right? So when Congress passed the joint return, they set the stage for the marriage bonus penalty to exist. Single wage earner couples who are most likely to be white get a tax cut when they marry, and equal earning couples who are most likely to be Black pay the marriage penalty. The key is which couples are likely to be single wage earner households and which are likely to be co-equal earners. Black Americans need two earners to make ends meet because the labor market doesn't compensate Black Americans the way it does white Americans. Right? So this is from a colleague, and the colleague summarizes this pretty well. He says, the tax code provides an incentive that is conceptually consistent with the man in the house rule. The man in the house rule said if you have a man in the house, no assistance or, / welfare. The tax code says if you have a man in the house, higher taxes. It makes the partnership less likely to be financially secure. It's way less over the top than welfare policy, but it's much more wide ranging. To the degree that we don't even think about the relationship between the tax policies that come out every year and the Black family, right? So the implications of Brown's work in this regard highlights the impact it has on keeping families from becoming families, right? Now, there are a lot of different factors that play into that. We can talk about the socialization of Black women. We can talk about the socialization of Black men, the extent to which the nuclear family structure is dismissed overall, and the extent to which both genders contribute to that. But how many of us have ever thought about taking into account the way our tax policies influence us? Now, recently, I did a series on the Institute for Black Male Studies.com, the website there. And the series, or I should say the webinar I did, a 2-part webinar, was the 10 policies that broke up the Black American family. Now, I did not include this, but I would. Because this is important. Because again, what we're talking about, when you talk about gender war, one of the things I've said for years is that it's contrived, and it promotes behavior incentivized by policy. And there are a number of key policies from the 1600s to now that have a strong influence on the Black family. So that said, the question becomes, how seriously do we take this? When do we begin to really step back and look at how we've come to where we are, including our behaviors, including our attitudes, including the extent to which many of us were not even raised around functional families in the Black community, let alone functional nuclear families, right? Dysfunction we've seen to such a great extent that we don't really know how to qualify family in many instances without it, especially the younger you are, right? Post 1970s, notion of family becomes more and more problematic and dysfunctional. So maybe the boomers can talk about it, but beyond that, it's a problem. But I'm interested in the ways in which subtle policies, but widespread, right, in their scope and their impact, have an influence. And we often don't know how to take that seriously, right? Now, this particular piece deals with a specific professor and author, right? She's an Emory University law professor, and Dorothy Brown is her name. And she is the author of How the Tax System Impoverishes Black Americans and How We Can Fix It. I should say the whiteness of wealth how the tax system impoverishes Black Americans and how we can fix it. So she offers solutions. This is not a piece I picked up yet. I just wanted to focus on the article, but I will be. It looks interesting. But she talks about going into this whole area race blind, right? And she was curious about it and so on and so forth. And you can check the article out yourself for those kind of details. I was more interested in it because the more I delve into this whole issue of the impact of policy on Black families, the more stunned I am. Not because I didn't think it was possible, but because I really underestimated how widespread it was and what the impact is multi-generationally, right? Multi-generationally. Because if we're having conversations about the gender war and we're talking about Gen X and millennials, trust me, most people are not ready for what Generation Z is already enacting. I got a 15-year-old in their very next room. And when I tell you their attitudes about coupling, especially in regard to race, are very different. Black boys have had it. Much of the time what they talk about are the behaviors that the girls they go to school with, you know, what they bring to the table. And what they bring to the table is the very same things you see in Tyler Perry movies, same things that they inherit from their mothers. Now, this isn't to suggest that Black males bring nothing to the table that's problematic, but it is to suggest that it's in many ways the boys that are looking at this, you know, and having conversations about whether or not they want to deal with it. But where is it coming from? Well, in many instances, it is coming from family. It is coming from media, right? But these attitudes in and of themselves have been emboldened and incentivized by policy. Policy that handicap Black males and push Black women further. Well, what kind of attitudes do you think are going to develop after 2 generations, 3 generations, when the majority of Black men you know are struggling or having some kind of issue? And the majority of Black women you know are leading their families, providing, cooking, not cooking, when, you know, paying bills, you know, head of the household, right? And you got policies that redefine marriage in a way that primarily benefits her, particularly upon divorce, and not him. I mean, all of these policies end up having an effect. But at one point in this article, when they ask her in an interview, because the first part of the article is a traditional article and the second part is more of an interview, they ask her at one point, in terms of the economic impact, what are the top 3 ways our tax code disfavors Black families? And she says, they're all bad. There isn't a top 3. And then they ask her, they say, well, your working parents received a marriage penalty because they earned roughly equal amounts. They owed more in taxes than, in your example, a white family of comparable income where one spouse makes all the money. Tell me about that. She says, had they filed as individuals, my parents would have paid less and the white couple would have paid more. The Tax Reform Act of 1969, legislation passed with 0 Black members on the House Ways and Means Committee, harmed couples making roughly equivalent income. The way that the tax structure was set up meant that married Black couples like my parents with 2 working spouses in which one partner makes at least 20% of the family's total income will pay a marriage penalty. So they ask her, that single worker couple enjoys other economic advantages too, such as, and she says, the value of services the stay-at-home spouse provides to the family is tax-free. The stay-at-home spouse can take care of whatever the working spouse needs and help that spouse advance with their career. The tax code treats a plumber and a nurse who have to pay for childcare and commuting expenses with after-tax income, the same as a high earner who earns their combined salary and has a spouse to stay at home and handle things like childcare. And they ask her, how did this rule come to pass? What makes it racially discriminatory? She says, when Congress passed the joint return, they set the stage for the marriage bonus penalty to exist. Single wage earner couples who are most likely to be white, and this is what I read earlier, right? Get a tax cut when they marry. Equal earning couples, not so much. And we know equal earning couples tend to be Black more often, right? So when you look at these kind of policies and how they affect Black family owners, what you got to do is you got to look at it over a longitudinal long period, right? You got to look at it over generations, and it becomes one of many different practices that contribute to the disassociation of Black coupling, marriage, and the nuclear family. Even though we know the statistics on how much better children do with their fathers present, hell, how much better they do when raised solely by their fathers versus by their mothers. But all of that we seem to forget about. And if we can find such a subtle issue that can have such a wide-ranging impact on how people even conceptualize marriage, if you know that everyone you saw growing up who experienced these kind of tax issues had less incentive to stay together, well, that's going to have an impact on separation, and thus an impact on what you grow up familiarizing yourself with when you think about family. There is one point that I wanted to add to this, where they ask her, do you think white America is oblivious to the obstacles that highly driven and well-educated Black Americans face in their ability to build and maintain wealth and to provide a financial cushion for their children? She says, I think most white Americans think the problem with the racial wealth gap is due to a disproportionate percentage of Blacks living in poverty. While it is true that roughly 22% of Blacks live in poverty, that means 78% do not. Why white people don't focus on the 78% is a complicated question. Is it that they don't know, that they don't want to know, that ignorance is bliss? Who knows? Anyway, so it's interesting there to examine the ways in which poverty plays a role into this as well. It's not as dramatic as one might think in certain respects, but when you compare it to other racial groups, when you compare the Black community status to other racial groups, you see a slightly different picture, right? But my main point in bringing this particular article up is just to focus on and meditate for a little bit on your own upbringing. I want you to actually think about how this may have shaped your understanding of coupling and marriage. If these de-incentivizing practices and policies gently begin to urge whole communities to move in a certain direction in terms of family development, would you know it? Could you think about how it impacted your particular family? Would it even cross your mind to do so? Didn't cross mine. Maybe you're better than I am. But these are the things we need to think about. Because if we don't, the situation continues to get worse. So anyway, just something to think about. Hope you enjoy your day. Peace.